And I'm here today to speak in favor of funding the 30th Avenue Corridor Active Transportation Plan Study. I've worked on transportation issues at Lane for 14 years, and my work has included coordinating a committee to write our transportation plan in 2006 and our climate action plan in 2011. And both plans included collaborating with local governments to improve bike and pedestrian access on 30th Avenue. The funding application does a great job of explaining all of the benefits of improving bike and pedestrian access on 30th Avenue, so I won't repeat that detail, except to say that a corridor plan to support active transportation on 30th Avenue is the first step towards improving safety, reducing congestion, reducing the maintenance burden, reducing greenhouse gases, and improving public health. So in conclusion, Lane Community College strongly supports this plan and urges the policy board to vote to fund the project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next we have Rob Zico.
Thank you, Chair Lykin, members of MPC. I'm Rob Zico, Executive Director of Better Eugene Springfield Transportation, and I want to speak to you this morning about productivity in transit. Productivity is a technical term which basically means how much bang for our buck are we getting? We invest public dollars in trying to move people. I mention this because it's been an underlying theme of a lot of our debates around transit community. 6 years ago, when MX West was approved, critics, whether rightly or wrongly, were saying, well, it's losing tax dollars, we're not getting productivity. Recently, LTD moved to reduce the frequency on the Gateway MX, again, concerns around productivity. And as we're looking as a community to invest in either in Eugene or Springfield, along Main Street in Springfield, or along corridors in Eugene, a question is going to be how many people are moving for our money. We're very fortunate in this community to have a national expert on productivity. Jarrett Walker works all over the country and is leading an effort with LTD called Transit Tomorrow. It's really timely. It's great. Edward's going to be talking about this a little later on. I just want to urge you to read the choices report that firm has already produced. And as I know you're busy, I have a cheat sheet version of it here, and I will just go over it quickly. So these are preliminary conclusions from the choices report by Jarrett Walker about the state of our transit system. Transit can serve many purposes. Which purposes it serves should depend upon our values. High ridership depends on making transit service useful and liberating. But ridership isn't just about service. High ridership also depends upon the built environment. And then he talks about the different parts of LTD service. The main part is fixed route service. The fixed route network is the core of LTD services. Most people can access bus service within a short walk, but few have access to frequent service. In some areas, two parallel routes go different places. This limits the frequency of both routes. The usefulness of the network depends a lot on your location. Ridership responds strongly to frequency. So I'm going to hand this out to you. It's a page. But the conclusion is that we're having a conversation as a community about what kind of transit service we should have or want. There's not one right answer. Edward later today is going to talk about that process and how we can engage. But the report talks about some key choices. Transit Tomorrow will examine what future LTD service could and should look like. Community input is critical in making the decisions on LTD's future service. And right now, 3 questions are being asked. How should we balance high ridership and extensive coverage? That's a productivity question. Is productivity what we're aiming for, or do we want to have lifeline service to lots of people all over? How should we balance walking and waiting? And does LTD's network need small adjustments or major overhaul? So I'm going to pass this out. This is really just a table of contents of a 60-page report. But reading through this, it actually begs some really important questions for our community. I could suggest what our answers to those might be. But right now we're having a community conversation. I urge you to read that table of contents and hopefully be engaged in this as policymakers, as I know you will. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Did I do that in 3 minutes? 60-page report?
2 minutes and 57 seconds. Not bad. All right, so that's who I have signed up for comments from the audience. I know we have 4 public hearings today, so if people are signed up for those, we'll wait to hear from those. So if anybody else wishes to speak to the committee? Okay, seeing none, then we will move on then to our issues today, and we'll start off with 6A, and that's the draft Title 6 and Environmental Justice Plan update. Looks like Ellen, you're up.
So So what we're having a public hearing on today is an update to our existing Title VI and Environmental Justice Plan that was adopted originally in 2009. We had an update in 2015. And the primary reason to update this Title VI plan is because we have new census data. So we go back in and look at the populations that are impacted by this law, and we update the census data to understand better the populations that are impacted by our transportation projects. So this is a fairly minor update. We did put in new census data, and it will be reflected in the maps that are in the plan. We also had some administrative changes about structuring and staff. If you'll recall, I sent out a survey about our demographics as a board, and we did that for our staff boards as well. So we update that. We update our MPO staff structure, LCOG's structure. The other things that we update on this is our public involvement around these populations. So what are the ways that we can reach out to these populations when we're doing transportation planning? And then a really important piece of this is how we document our procedures and our complaint process. So if people feel that there is an issue around the way that we're doing this, they have a really clear way to find where to issue a complaint. So all of those things get updated when we do a review of this plan. We update some strategies for improving our data collection. And one thing we did this time that's new, and I apologize, it didn't have internet access to show you, but we did include some Title VI visualizations on our data portal. So I know I'm always talking about our data portal, but if you do have an opportunity to look at those new visualizations, they're in the demographics section. It has all of our Title VI information in there, and almost all of our jurisdictions also have Title VI plans, so it could be information that's useful to you as you're working through these issues in your own planning. So if you have a chance to check those out and you have feedback, let me know. And if it is something that you find useful, we can do trainings for your staff or for your boards if you would like to use those for your planning processes as well.
Do we have any questions before we open the public hearing? I just have one question.
Yes.
So you said update on the census data, so the census is every 10 years. So is this Portland State estimates?
No, they do is something called the American Community Survey that happens more frequently.
Okay.
And we base that on multiple years data so that we have more of a data set to work from. So yeah, we don't have, I think there's one category that's only with the 10-year census. But
Okay.
all the other categories, we have updates through the ACS.
Okay, very good. Any other questions?
So, yeah, Ellen, so we're just getting ready to kick off, and I was gonna talk about that later, the Delta to River Road project for the Beltline. And that's kind of our National Environmental Policy Act work. Public involvement's a big component of it. And the other one we're working on is the 126 West between Eugene and Bonita. I want to make sure that the consultants that we hire to help us with that are in contact with you and use this information. So how do I do that? Just talk to you? Huh?
Yep, yeah,
Okay.
just send them to me, and all of
Okay,
the
good.
information is pretty much on our website. And the cool thing about that data portal is that it's pretty interactive, and you can download information from there.
Great.
There are some things that are good to keep in mind when working with ACS data. They're estimates, and so we just want to be cautious about the way that we talk about it. It's not a, exact number, they're estimates.
Okay. And I had a curiosity about how we deal with the transient college population, because they're not permanent resident. Do we think of them as permanent residents, or because there's a lot of diversity among?
Yeah, I mean, you will see when you look at some of these data, you'll see kind of a high concentration of poverty in the university area. And we just sort of know that that's, maybe not a true.
Okay. So we just take that into account as it's like a temporary population, not a permanent population?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Mayor Lumberg?
So in keeping with that temporary population, how does that affect grants, et cetera? Because many times our grant processes are based on population bases. And if you're looking at that demographic and it says, oh, this area is low income or whatever, does that influence how someone can apply for grants, even though we know locally, anecdotally, that it's a student population? How does that affect the way it's seen in the broader community and specifically around funding.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it would impact it too dramatically unless you're looking at something very specific to that location. Because there's other pieces of information that you can put into your grant application that I think would kind of round out the understanding of that particular block group that you're looking at.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, so at this time, I'll open the public hearing. I don't know if we have anybody signed up.
There's nobody signed up this time for this topic.
Okay. So, yeah, so I'll go ahead and open the public hearing. Anybody wishing to speak to the subject, please come forward, state your name and your address for the record. And seeing nobody, will close the public hearing. And again, how long do we have to provide feedback to staff? So how long do you need, or how long do we have as a group?
Public comment is open for 30 days, and we won't be taking action, well, we'll potentially be taking action in September at our meeting. So anytime before then,
Okay,
if you have comments or questions, feel free to get in touch with me.
very good. All right, thank you very much. Next item is the performance-based planning and programming draft addendum to FY 1821 MTIP. And Dan?
Okay, this is the performance-based planning and programming draft addendum to the adopted 18 to 21 Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program for the MPO. So the recent federal transportation legislation established a new performance-based approach to planning and programming, and there were some requirements along with that. It identified specific performance measures and requires that state DOTs, MPOs, and transit districts adopt targets towards relevant to each of those measures and then track their progress towards meeting those targets that they've established. The MPO has been working with ODOT and with Lane Transit District and incorporating these into our planning efforts. One of the requirements with this is that all MTIPs approved or amended after May 27th, 2018 must demonstrate support of the targets adopted by the MPO. At this time, the targets adopted by the MPO are just the safety targets. The MPO agreed to support the state's targets for that, but we do need to demonstrate such in our adopted MTIP. So attachment 1 is the language that is proposed to be amended as an addendum to our adopted MTIP. It will satisfy the requirements. Just to summarize what's in there, pretty much it explains what performance-based planning is. It lists out the measures that are identified in the federal legislation, identifies the targets that the MPO has adopted, and the deadlines for adopting the future targets that are coming up. And importantly, how the MTIP supports the achievement of those targets through our investments. A lot of this language is based on a template that was provided by the Salem MPO, who took a first crack at this and ran it by Federal Highways, who said, this is great. If everyone did something like this, we'd be happy. So we took that as a template and adopted the language, making it relevant to the targets that we set into our MPO. So we have assurance that this would be, the feds would be okay with this. I will draw your attention to page 3, where there's a hyperlink that's inserted there, and there's an important reason for that. One of the complications with this process is that our planning documents aren't updated as frequently as the targets are updated. So how do we demonstrate that our MTIP supports the targets when the targets are going to change a year later and we won't have an opportunity to update this for another 3 years or so? So the solution was to put a hyperlink in there to ODOT's website where they will keep the most up-to-date adopted targets, and we can simply reference in our document that we support the state targets to see that target follow this link. And we've been told that would be perfectly acceptable and probably good practice. Going above and beyond, the next pages at the very bottom of 4 and then 5 and 6 identify how specifically in a numerical form the projects in our MTIP are working towards the targets that we've adopted. For example, with safety targets, as of June 2018, our MTIP includes $21 million in highway safety improvement projects, $42 million in urban upgrade projects, just as an example, a way of more directly showing how the projects in our MTIP support the targets. So what we're asking for today is a public hearing and then action at the September meeting following the 30-day public comment period. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can.
Questions? Patty?
I just have a little question. There was a new term in here for me. It's called road diet. Can you tell me what that is?
Doesn't sound good.
Like road kills?
No. No, so it's just a strategy to, well, what's the best way of describing it?
A road
I can
diet,
give you an
perhaps. Well, go ahead.
An example would be the changes on South Willamette in Eugene, where we took, I think it was a 4-lane road and converted it to 3 lanes. So we created a left turn lane in the center and
So it's
reduced it by a lane. So it's one strategy for traffic issues. Depending on what your issue is, it can be referred to as a road diet.
Thank you.
It typically reduces the vehicular travel lanes or capacity in some way and improves other modes travel through that corridor.
So it's also referred to as a roadway reconfiguration.
We could talk about our diets that way.
Physical, yeah.
All right, is there any other questions? Okay. Seeing none then, this time we'll open the public hearing, so anybody wishing to speak to this subject, please come forward, state your name and address for the record. I see Rob,
I didn't sign up, but
please come forward.
seeing that nobody else is planning to testify. Thank you, Chair Like and members of MPC. I'm Rob Zico, again, Executive Director of Better Eugene Springfield Transportation. But I'm also Research Associate at the University of Oregon Sustainable Cities Initiative, and have done some national level research on performance measures coming out of MAP 21, and so speaking more from that perspective. In terms of your action before you and to do in September, we support what's before you. This is a step forward in measuring how our transportation investments are achieving things that are important to us. So that's good and won't suggest any changes this time. But I will highlight a couple things. So I was speaking to you before about productivity and transit. The transit elements of MAP 21 are fairly weak. It talks about things like the condition of buses and rolling stock and stuff like that. It doesn't talk about ridership. If ridership is something that's important to us in terms of how many people we move, that might be something you want to consider in this. There's also no mention of biking and walking. Again, these are federal requirements, and you're following what the federal requirements are. The federal government tends to emphasize highways more, is less interested in transit, and doesn't really think about other things. And the climate change rules are still under development and are fairly weak at the national level, but given that we have some climate change goals in the state of Oregon and here locally, that's something you might look at. The other thing I'll say is that performance measures, and we support this, this is a good step forward, but they come out of the for-profit world. The idea is what you measure is what will happen. If we measure this, then we'll achieve it. And in the business world where you're looking at a bottom line and there's sort of feedback, that often works out. In the public sector, there's actually little evidence that that's the case. You set targets and goals over here and you make investments over there, and there's not a lot of connection. And there's a huge gap between the day-to-day, month-to-month decisions you make and these outcomes. And for these to actually be effective, to hold ourselves accountable to them, you need to connect the dots of saying, what investments are we looking at, what do those lead to, what do those lead to, and how does that connect to targets? If you're making investments that are going to do things over here and you're measuring something over there, you just find out, oh crap, you know, we didn't make our targets, or we did, but it's because China did something that reduced the cost of, or increased the cost of something, and so yay, we're beating our targets. Again, for the purposes before you, these are fine. go ahead and adopt these. They're a step forward, it's good. But as we're talking about how to invest taxpayer money more cost effectively, performance measures are going to be really important, and we locally can do more than the federal government's requiring us to do. Thank you.
Bravo.
Thank you. Anybody else wishing to speak? Okay, seeing none, then we'll close the public hearing and just make note that we did hear from Dr. Zico on this subject too. So, anything to add from staff? Paul?
I had a couple of just real quick notes. As Dan mentioned, this is language being added to your TIP, which is where the funds get programmed. It is not the only place where you're going to see performance measures reflected and discussed, so there will be other opportunities, especially after we have completed all the work on all of the performance measures. As Dan said, the only one that you formally adopted are related to safety. There's still other ones that we'll be bringing to you over the next year or so. And a lot of that work is going to be reflected in the upcoming update to the long-range plan, the regional transportation plan. We will be doing more work around what Dr. Zico said, discussing how to achieve these targets and how to program funds to help us achieve those targets. The other real quick comment I want to make is on page 3 of this. At the bottom of the table of federal performance measures, there's a quick single asterisk footnote about the greenhouse gas emissions target being in the process of being revoked. That was formally revoked on May 31st. That target is no longer part of these required measures. So we will eventually update this language to just remove it from the document because the MPO is no longer required under the federal requirements to address that.
Is that simply a sign of the times of the federal administration in place?
Correct.
Yes.
Got it. Thank you.
One last question I have on this subject, though. So, because ODOT is the caretaker of this, especially from the, so with the transportation package that went into place, there is pretty specific language around transparency. And while the law was passed by the legislature, they're still continuing to work on language. And I think this language is pretty firmed up, but do you see this as adding more workload to you because of the specific, what they're asking for from a transparency perspective? Or maybe if you can just comment on that briefly, or if you can't, maybe just kind of take a look and maybe a future email back to the group. I don't know if you can even talk to it today, but if not, it'd be interesting just to know that in the future and what ODOT is asking for. And because they're the caretaker, I'm assuming that language that's written in will deal with this as well. So I don't know if you have any comments on that right now or not.
I can try to make some comments, and please let me know if I'm not addressing what you're asking. There's two things I think I heard. One is that ODOT is essentially the caretaker, as you put it, of these federal requirements, and seeing that, not only the DOT is required to establish these performance measures, but that within the state, DMPOs are also required to establish them, and typically ODOT is, as you said, the caretaker of that. ODOT has been convening statewide meetings of all of the MPOs and ODOT to try and coordinate that. That process, that role of ODOT is not adding any workload to us other than what the federal requirements had already added. If anything, ODOT is trying to make the workload a little lighter for us by helping us with information, or by convening those statewide meetings so that all the MPOs can share the information, by providing some templates that we can use, by helping us get these things reviewed. The other part of, I think what you were saying was, did HB 17, the state legislation, add any workload to us in terms of transparency? I don't really see that having happened at the MPO level. It has happened for the local jurisdictions. There are new reporting requirements for the local jurisdictions around pavement and infrastructure condition and other things. So I think the HB 2017 workload has fallen largely on ODOT, secondarily on the local jurisdictions, not so much on the MPO.
And it's my understanding that just because the feds have rolled back the GHG issue, the emission issue, states still can put their own emissions program in place, isn't that correct?
That is correct. There is.
I think that's called states' rights. That's the last I checked. So it's in the Constitution. I don't know. There's something vaguely written about that, but, so I didn't know if that's, so,
That not only is true, but there are continuing conversations in this state about the GHG targets,
yeah.
about the transportation strategy around those, and around cap and invest, which is tangentially related to that.
Yeah. That's all the questions I have. Any other questions? All right, very good. Thank you. Move on to item 3, which is the FFY 1921 STBG TAP and CMAC funding proposals. And Dan, you're not moving. So.
I'm not. Yes, thanks. So this is programming the MPO's discretionary funds for FY 19, 20, and 21, and specifically presenting a funding proposal that was recommended by TPC, the Transportation Planning Committee. So these are the federal funds that the MPO has to use at their discretion for projects within the MPO. These are STBG, the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program, TAP, which is Transportation Alternatives, and CMAC, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Program. Over this time period, 19 through 21, it's a total of about $18 million for projects within our MPO. So starting back in March, the Technical Advisory Subcommittee began conversations about what those investments might be, what are some projects that we might use those funds for. An early brainstorm list came up with about 47 projects, totaling roughly double what we have available. So in subsequent meetings, that was winnowed down a little bit through conversation and considering other things. Eventually, there were 32 applications that were formally submitted, totaling just 21.5 million, about 3.5 more than is available. So at that point, TASC and the Transportation Planning Committee began more intense discussions and scrutinizing these applications and reviewing them over the project selection criteria and the timeliness, and ultimately arrived at their June 20th meeting at a proposal that they recommend to MPC for funding. If you see attachment 1, that lists the 32 applications that were received and the amounts that were requested in those applications. The table to the right shows what funds we have to use at our discretion and where those are coming from, totaling $17.9 million. Attachment 2 shows again that same list of the 32 applications, the amount that was requested, and then the second dollar column, TPC recommends, that is what is being recommended by the Transportation Planning Committee for funding. The columns to the right just breaks out the recommended funding amounts into separate funding categories for STBG, TAP, and CMAC. Ultimately, the recommended amount is $500,000 over what's available. The reasoning behind that is for the $500,000 item under LCOG, Household Travel and Activity Survey. It's an important project, and the group recommends that we use 2022 STBG funds for that, which is within our rights. We can do that. In fact, other MPOs have programmed their funds through 2024. There's no reason we can't use 2022 for this. So that's why the numbers are about 500,000 off. I will also point out that the list of projects in attachment 2 is actually 33 and not 32, because it includes LTD, the bottom project there. This is the next agenda item, and I can go into more detail on it when we get there. This is kind of a special case where they're proposing to switch already approved and programmed CMAC funds for non-programmed STBG funds, give those CMAC funds back into this pool. Again, what we're asking for today is a public hearing with action in September following a 30-day public comment period. I'm happy to answer any questions, especially the gray column, the recommendation column, and right. If you have questions about specific projects, I'll probably defer to staff, to local staff, but feel free to ask those questions.
Clear?
My question is actually a request, so I don't see a gray column anywhere, so, and that's kind of the nature of my request. In the agenda item, attachments are referred to by numbers, but then the attachments themselves aren't numbered.
Right.
So that would be super helpful. And I didn't know what the funding table was with the FY19, FY20, FY21. So if items like that can be labeled in the future, that would also be super helpful.
Thanks, that's good feedback.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so at this time I'll open the public hearing. I have 2 people signed up. And I'll call your name and how I received. So the first name I have is David Martin. So if you could please state your name and address and limit your time to 3 minutes with us. Thank you.
So my name is David Martin, and I live at 3426 Honeywood Street, which is right off of Gilliam Road. And I would like to ask you to support the Gilliam Road upgrades from Ayers all the way to Muir Pond Way. This stretch of road has been reported in a KEZI News segment because of the danger of it. Elementary school students from Gilliam Elementary and Cal Young Middle School are forced to travel, walk, or bicycle in the same road as cars and trucks that are going 35 miles an hour. And there's no, for most of this stretch of road, there's no sidewalks, there's no bike lanes, and there's also no shoulders. Right at the edge of the white fog line are deep ditches that switch back and forth from either side of the road. And so pedestrians and cars and bikes are all forced in the same area. And I live here, I work on this stretch of road, I'm the pastor at Gilliam Community Church. And so I'm on this road almost every day. And my wife and I have 3 little kids, ages 5, 3, and 1, and when we are pushing the stroller and we're having to walk on Gilliam Road, we're always looking over our shoulder where a car is coming from or a truck, and when cars and trucks are both at the same place at the same time with a pedestrian or bicyclist, it's very dangerous. And so I would really ask that you guys would support the funding to upgrade this road all the way to Muir Pond Way. This is the only major road in or out of our neighborhood. So all the new development that's going on in our neighborhood is all funneled onto this one road. Unfortunately, this road is stuck between the county and the city. The county owns it, but doesn't have the money to upgrade it. The city won't take ownership of it until the county upgrades it. So both governments are pointing their fingers at each other and nobody's doing anything. In the meantime, people's lives are on the line. Bailey Hill Road was not upgraded until somebody died. I don't want Gilliam Road to sit around and wait to get upgraded until some kid gets killed because they're trying to go to the park or go to school. So I'm passionate, that's why I got on the Northeast Neighborhood Board, it's because I'm passionate about seeing Gilliam Road upgraded to a regular city street. It's a 35-mile-an-hour road with a lot of traffic. It's the major road into this neighborhood, and it should be a regular city street. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next we have, is it John Funding? Pardon me? Fievel. Okay, John Fievel.
Hi, my name is John Fievel, F-A-V-I-L-L-E. I also, like David, am on the Northeast Neighborhood Association Board. I live at 2216 Marie Lane, which is just off of Gilliam Road. I'm also here speaking about the fact that both upgrade and safety improvements are included in the MPO funding package. I guess you guys are voting on next month, if I understand it right. And David has talked a lot about the specific dangers and risks people experience and see along there. I want to add a couple of more points. David mentioned Gilliam Elementary School. And if you look at the safe routes to school map for the area, Most of that stretch of North Gilliam falls within the half-mile radius, so it's a 12-minute walk, very readily walkable. All of it falls within the mile, which I guess is still considered walkable for grade school kids. And there, for all of it, it's the natural channel, but very clearly on the map, it's not shown as a safe route because it just isn't. Big issue on people's minds for many years. Next point I want to make is there has been recent development and a lot in the area. It's about a slightly over half-mile stretch of road, but in the last 4 years, since August of 2014, there have been 8 new subdivisions that are putting another 200 homes in there. Very, very rapid development. Some of them are already built up, the earlier ones. The later ones are filling in. By the time this funding gets actually moved out into the streets, I'm sure they'll all be filled up. More cars, more kids, more bikes, et cetera. This has been an issue on the neighborhood's minds for many, many years, and they've talked to anyone who will listen about it. There are several more people in the audience here who could speak if you want to hear more. I also want to say that the staff tells us they've received roughly 40 emails from people living up and down that stretch of road. And I encourage you to look at them because you'll hear observed instances of danger, you'll hear near misses, you'll hear people's complaints and issues, very, very strongly voiced. So I guess with that, I will just ask you please to vote for the funding because we've been asking for it for years, and I thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's who I have signed up. Is there anybody else wishing to speak to this subject?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, my name is Joe Enders. I live on the corner of Gilliam and Creekside. And I agree with the comments that are made in terms of the safety in the area. My concern is where's the cost going to come from? In the past, I understand, like with Ayers Road, that it came, the projects were paid for by the people living adjacent to the road. So is that what would happen in this case?
You know what I'll do is I'll have staff actually maybe get in contact with you to maybe explain where the funding comes from and how it works, if you're good with that. Right now, this is a public hearing, so we're just listening to folks wishing to testify, but on specific, we'll make sure that staff addresses your particular issue of concern.
Okay.
Joe, I see Becky Taylor taking notes in the back right now. So.
Who's Lane County's transportation?
So would this be the appropriate forum to address the speed limit on Gilliam?
Staff? I don't think so.
It's not.
I mean, it can be, but I would suggest.
Well, it's real short.
Yeah.
Speed limit on Gilliam right now is 35 miles an hour for the most part. There's no reason for it to be 35. Why can't it be changed to 20? To at 25, like a residential area is concerned, it's no longer a country area, and so that would improve safety somewhat in the area just by that simple reduction in speed. Okay. My only other comment has to do with the stopping points proposal is to have the sidewalk on the west side go out to Mirror Pond. When I moved into the area, excuse me, 8 years ago, I put in a walking path in front of my place, about 7 foot wide gravel for people to walk. And so, I mean, I would think that would still serve the safety issue in the area. And most of my neighbors have a similar type thing north of, I think it's Nelson Way. So my proposal would be that take into consideration that north of Nelson Way, you pretty much have a walking area for people already. Okay. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Anybody else wishing to speak? Okay, at this time then we'll close the public hearing. And any additional questions, direction to staff? Paul?
I just want to make one quick note. The person from Lane Community College who spoke during the public comment period on the 30th Avenue Corridor Active Transportation Project, even though that wasn't during the public hearing, that should be on the record because
Yep.
the public comment period is open.
Okay, very good. Mr. Farr?
Thank you. Reverend Martin, Pastor Martin, and John, I've heard you guys talking about this for so long, it is embarrassing to me that we've not done something about it by now. So this is, it seems like the wheels are turning, albeit slowly, but your words through the years have been heard, and staff have been working on it. You say that the city and the county point at each other. That's pretty much what happens, but really, it's because of the nature of the road itself. You know, it needs to be brought up to city standards. The county doesn't bring things up to city standards. We don't have the funds or the wherewithal or the policy to do that. So it's a matter of coordinating between the city and the county. And as you know, as they build more development, more dense development beyond where the sidewalks end, those kids, there's no roads. And David, you did not mention the lights. You said the no sidewalk, no traffic controls, and no lights either. So in the winter, when it gets dark at 4:30 p.m. and kids are coming home from practice, they're doing it in the dark. So thanks for being here.
Can I ask one more comment? So what happens?
No, sorry. Public comment's over, so I apologize. So, Councilor Surratt?
Yeah, so I just wanted to share for folks who've come from Northeast Neighbors that Councilor Clark at the Eugene City Council has raised these safety issues there in our conversations at various times. So you are being heard and your message is being brought forward, and so I've certainly heard it. And when I look through our packet in preparation for today's meeting, I refresh my memory about what some of those issues were, and I especially appreciate the mention of the safe routes to school and the constraint that we can't actually use that road as part of a safe routes, which would make a lot of sense given how the residential area has built up. And it seems like an obvious choice for a safe routes to school route, but right now it's out of the question. And so I'm hoping that we can get approval for this particular funding, which would be a big step towards starting to alleviate those concerns.
Paul?
To address the question during the hearing about cost and the funding for it, I confirmed what I understood with Becky just now. So to be clear, the funding request is to use federal funds, as you know, to construct this project with the non-federal match that's shown in the table coming from Lane County in-kind contributions. In other words, their staff time, their contributions to the work on the project. At this time, there's no indication of any local contribution from the property owners.
Other questions? I just want to make note real quick, because if you notice in those columns, CMAC money. And I just want to remind us, the great work that Mayor Lundberg, Paul, our staff did, working with OTC to make sure we got our fair share of CMAC money, is now paying dividends. We're now seeing it right before us, because we were being shut out for years. And I know Mayor Lundberg put her claws in it, and this is the reason why we have this money today. And so I just want to say thank you very much, Mayor, for your incredible work on this. You would not let this go. And for Paul, for the great assistance and just the staff involved here. This is millions of dollars of money that is now being available that we did not have before. And so this is great work by our support. But Mayor Lundberg had the face-to-face, and Paul, your support on that, just providing the information was fantastic. So I just want to say thank you to all those involved to make sure we got this money, because we're now seeing dividends being paid off right now that would not have worked if we would not have worked overtime to make sure we received that money.
I do want to give Paul a lot of credit, because he worked for a very long time and knew the issue way back in the 80s or 90s. When we've not gotten our fair share
For a long time.
A long time, and Paul did all the homework and understands transportation well enough to know how to put together an argument that was satisfactory. And to give also Salem Kaiser and that
Yep.
the MPO from that area, all the credit to, because they were at the table also to me, because we were the two areas that weren't getting our fair share, so.
It always helps to have a county commissioner as the chair of the Oregon Transportation Commission, has a little bit of local government background to be receptive, so we're pretty grateful for that as well. But thank you for that. Just wanted to make note of that. Any other, okay. So your direction, you're good for next month?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on then to amendment to the Metropolitan Transportation Improvement Program. This is LTD request to program STBG U funds. And Dan, you're just not moving today, are you? All right.
This is my last thing. So I said that I'd be talking about this, this LTD item. This is a request to program STBG funds. This is a project, an LTD project, to install a traffic signal at Green Lane and River Road as part of the greater Santa Clara Community Transit Center project. These funds were awarded by, or approved by MPC a year ago, $600,000 CMAC dollars. Now, there are certain strings attached to CMAC funds, a little stringent as far as eligibility. This project was seen as eligible in that it reduced emissions, and it was among the 17 eligible project criteria for CMAC funds. So we programmed that. It was a year later that ODOT reached out and had some questions about eligibility. Their concern was that the traffic light, the purpose of the traffic light was to reduce bus idling and reduce congestion at the entrance points to the transit center. So the transit center being its own project and being put in there presently, they saw that as a concern that this is not reducing emissions, but nullifying emissions that are being created by the same project, which our Transportation Planning Committee disagreed with, and it was kind of a hot topic for a while, but it was actually a convenient time for that to come up, if it was going to come up, because we're talking separately about programming new funds, and the idea was proposed to swap out these CMAC funds, put them back into the pool, and take some STBG funds and make it a moot point. So that's what's being proposed here, and it is a fairly clean swap in that those original CMAC funds, if you see from attachment 2 on the previous page, those CMAC funds that are being programmed currently require a 20% match, whereas the STBG is just a 10.27% match. Well, these CMAC funds a year ago were not 20% match. They're a 10.27% match, just like the STBG. So to swap them out would require no more or less money from LTD, and giving them back into the pool is not taking from anybody else. So it's a good opportunity, I think, to solve this problem quickly without holding up LTD's process a little bit. So that's what's being proposed. We're handling it as a separate amendment because really it is separate from the earlier discussion of programming these new funds. This is an already existing project with approved funds. We just want to switch the fund source so that LTD doesn't have to bother with the red tape and can move forward. And in fact, if you do look back at attachment number 2 from the previous item, under that traffic signal LTD project showing the 600,000 STBG, the project just above that, the LTD electric bus fleet procurement, is the project that is being proposed to receive those CMAC funds anyways. So it's going to take 600,000 from the CMAC and the other 400,000 from the new CMAC. So it's a pretty clean swap all around. What we're requesting is a public hearing today and then action at September following the 30-day public comment period.
Paul?
The other more colloquial way to put FHWA and ODOT's concern in a strict reading of the CMAC requirements, which says that it has to mitigate air quality issues, was that the air quality issue doesn't exist yet because the buses aren't idling there yet. So we could have waited and created the pollution and then done this with CMAC funds. but we decided let's be proactive and use the STBG funds.
Questions? All right, seeing none, then we'll open the public hearing. So anybody interested in commenting on this subject, please come forward, state your name and address for the record. And seeing no one, we'll close the public hearing. And I think I heard you, Dan, I think you heard you say from a timing perspective, there's really no disruption, is that correct?
Right, just the delay in going out for public comment.
Yeah, okay, very good. Okay. Anything to add?
Any other comments or concerns, or if not, it'll come back for action next month.
All right, very good. All right, thank you very much. Next item then is legislative priorities, and Paul?
So in your packet is a cover memo and again an attachment, which is the one that you saw back in May and also the one that you approved about 2 years ago. I'm going to quickly address the cover memo plus one or two other comments. If you recall, back before the 2017 legislative session, you approved legislative priorities that are, again, the attachment here. In preparing for the upcoming 2019 full session, we wanted to have a discussion with you about priorities, transportation-related priorities for that session. The legislative days are coming up in late September. OMPOC, the Oregon MPO Consortium, is meeting tomorrow, and we'll be discussing this in terms of trying to get the statewide consortium to agree on some priorities. And other bodies around the state are also developing legislative priorities. Frankly, to be honest, and I think I mentioned this back in May, what we're hearing from legislators, from the Oregon Transportation Forum and other sources, is that there's not an expectation of any new substantial transportation funding in the upcoming session. What I've heard directly from a couple of the legislators is that by the time at least three other priorities are dealt with by the legislature, healthcare funding, PERS, and education, there won't be any money left. Possibly, if there's funding, there seems to be some hope around funding for aviation and funding for Connect Oregon, because if you recall, neither one of those were really addressed in HB 2017. Aviation not at all, and HB 2017 only included Connect Oregon funding for a few specific projects, namely those transload or transmodal facilities, and nothing else in terms of an ongoing Connect Oregon program. So again, the priorities that you discussed and approved 2 years ago are the attachment, but let me go to the cover memo real quick because we have added a couple suggestions here. The Transportation Planning Committee is recommending 4, if you will, new or maybe more current additions, and I have one other that I'm going to mention because it's come up elsewhere. The cover memo says, talks about automated speed enforcement, and there is some background there which we drew from a League of Oregon Cities document. We can talk about that more if you have questions. Number 2 is local authority over speed limits. You heard a concern just a few minutes ago about the speed limit on Gilliam Road. We know that there have been several other examples locally of trying to get speed limits adjusted. I know of one personally in the city of Coburg and elsewhere. It's a very difficult process now, and you don't really have local control over that. Number 3 and 4 are the 2 that I just mentioned, Connect Oregon and aviation funding being addressed where they weren't fully addressed in HB 2017. And then I mentioned one other. I'm going to mention it because it's part of the League of Oregon Cities legislative priorities discussion, and I think it's one that may be of interest here. If you recall, Safe Routes to Schools was part of HB 2017 funding, but it came with a 40% match requirement, and for certain categories of applicants, mainly low income schools, a 20% match requirement. League of Oregon Cities is putting forth as a priority reducing those match requirements to 20% and 10%. So I wanted to mention that here. What we're looking for today is a discussion among you, some at least initial guidance, particularly to your OMPOC representatives that will be discussing this with the full OMPOC board tomorrow. And we'll be back to you next month with a report on OMPOC's discussion tomorrow.
Commissioner Farr?
Thanks. You know, Paul, a lot of the things that we ask for require money. And some things just require a little bit of common sense, which sometimes costs money, sometimes doesn't. When we're talking about, for instance, local control of speed limits, as we, around city limits in particular, we look at River Road, for instance, which just had a speed limit change. But the process that it takes to get what makes sense, a sensible speed limit change, it takes so long to make it happen. And you said there's a consideration of asking for local control of speed limits?
It's both a consideration that the MPOs are, I think, going to band together on, because I'm hearing it from the other MPO managers, as well as, I'd say, one of the 29 priorities in the full legislative discussion that the League of Oregon Cities has put out. So they are also trying to get behind that request.
And while it does take some bandwidth with the lobbying folks, the cost of doing it is, there's not a capital outlay. I mean, there's not a great deal of money involved in switching that. It's just a matter of taking the time to explain the benefits of it and making sure that the people locally support it. It's what we try to do at the county quite often, is do the stuff that makes sense. It doesn't cost a great deal of money. Why not do it? And that seems to me to be a relatively easy fix for what have been pretty serious concerns. You head north out of Coburg, people gun the gas right at about the fire station, I think is where they started speeding up. So that by the time you get to the 55-mile-an-hour limit, they've been going 55 a long time before they get to that. So changing that 55-mile-an-hour limit to another half mile out might make it safer. And that's just one single example of local control. The people who live there know what it should be. People who sort through the numbers in Salem, and I'm not an anti-government person by any stretch of the imagination, but when we can have local control, let's have it. It doesn't cost a lot of money, let's go for it.
And again, I agree, Commissioner, that both that request and the automated speed enforcement, although I can't say what the legislation would look like and what the legislative council would determine, but I would anticipate that they would have zero or no fiscal impact. They really are about trying to get the ability from our perspective, for local concerns around safety to be addressed locally. Exactly. Both of these, the speed enforcement and the speed limit, are directly a result of our safety plan discussions and that work more than anything.
And I see Patty and Ann both nodding their heads over there by that Coburg Road, and I see Carlene nodding her head about River Road, and we've already heard from Gilliam. So.
And from the county's perspective, and again, not to speak for the county, but what I've heard is if you look at the automated speed enforcement background and some of the other information around it, right now it's allowed at intersections, but it's sort of hard to find an intersection in a rural area of the county sometimes. You want to enforce it between those 10-mile apart intersections.
Yeah, and I'm sure there are policies and processes and procedures and reasons, but once again, one of the main issues is the bandwidth of the people who do the lobbying. How much time do they have to take the time, when there are many other things on the slate. Hey, Ross.
Commissioner Lycan, do you mind if I add something about speed limits? So I'm Rob Interfeld again with the City of Eugene. Tom Boyott and Councilor Evans from the City of Eugene and I participated on the League of Oregon Cities Transportation Policy Committee that made some of the similar recommendations to what we're talking about here today. And one outcome of that is that I think ODOT's afraid that the legislature is going to mandate some new changes. And so there's going to be a working group that has its first meeting in the next couple of weeks that I'll be participating in. That's the League of Oregon Cities, Association of Oregon Counties, and ODOT to try to maybe come to some common ground on how to set speed limits. And I think broadly speaking, the issue is kind of like the engineering approach to setting speed limits versus what may seem like common sense, kind of like the idea of could you move that 25 mile per hour a few blocks west in Coburg? So and it's, I guess from my perspective, ODOT, it's hard for them to change the way that speed limits are set, but there's a lot of change going on at the national level that's starting to inform different ways of setting speed limits, and some of it is coming from groups that do have engineers involved, and so I think there's some hope that we can start to see things differently here in Oregon and get local governments a little more control. So we'll see what comes out of this, but that's our hope.
Thanks for stepping forward, Rob.
Sure.
It sounds to me, I'm pleased that it's in good hands. Thank you.
Mayor Venus?
Thank you, just a follow-up question on the comment about the safe routes to schools and reduced match. What are the implications of that? I mean, would we not have enough money to do certain things, or does it then open the door, or?
Well,
what are the
unfortunately,
implications?
it would mean that fewer projects would get done if less match was brought to those projects and the total cost was remain the same. To try and illustrate that or give some perspective on it, when HB 2017 was under development and the work groups were looking at the Safe Routes to Schools funding, I think I've described to you before that the way they arrived at the 40% match requirement was that they looked at all of the projects that they thought the state of Oregon needed throughout the state to address the Safe Routes to Schools concerns within, I think the initial, now I'm forgetting, but I think the initial distance was a quarter mile. And they said, okay, that's gonna cost X amount, and here's the revenue that we're anticipating raising, and in order to do all those projects for a reasonable amount of time, we'll need 40% match. Well, one thing happened that significantly changed that was they increased in the final bill the distance to 1 mile. So already right there, the money's not gonna go as far in terms of the number of projects that get done, because you can have more projects eligible. And yes, if you reduce the match requirement, that's going to use more state money, so the state money won't go as far in terms of the number of projects. You could say that you want to pair this with a request to increase the Safe Routes to Schools funding. But yes, I hope that addresses what you were asking.
I think I could add to that a little bit. By the math, the money won't go as far, but more deserving projects will be able to move forward for consideration, because if a jurisdiction couldn't provide the match, you're never going to see that go forward. So it's about finding that balance between, it's kind of accessibility to the Safe Routes program. And I think we want that to be as fair as possible statewide.
Makes sense.
So Lake Oswego doesn't get them all.
Well, I mean, that would be okay.
Thank you.
Any more to add?
No, I guess I would also just ask our two OMPOC representatives going into tomorrow's meeting, are there head nods? We've generally done this, especially when there's a meeting coming up the next day and we want to report back to you on those discussions before we really finalize this to go to Salem. Are there head nods around the 4 or 5 things we've talked about adding, the 4 in the middle plus the Safe Routes to Schools match? So Mayor Lundberg, do you have any questions? Or?
No, I don't have questions, but I would like I appreciate the feedback before we go into the meeting, so that we have a way to put our position here at Central Lane on the table tomorrow.
So also, when I look at the packet in full, there's an attachment that says draft 2018 legislative priorities. That was from this year?
It says draft 2018 because we're in calendar year 2018, and it talks about advocating for the Oregon legislature in 2019.
2019, okay.
But this draft was simply really what you approved prior to the 2017 session, so
Okay.
sorry for any confusion.
Okay, and so this list of items is much longer than the few that we're talking about currently.
Yes.
And so tomorrow, we will be taking this entire list.
There will be a discussion that will probably not touch on all of these, but this list, since you already approved it, I think is safe for us to discuss as, an agreed to list by this body tomorrow, plus these other 4 or 5 pending further discussion. And admittedly, some of these were addressed in, HB 2017,
Right.
Obviously, support increasing investment in Safe Routes to Schools. Well, that happened to an extent in 2017. Now, you may want to leave it in here because of the discussion we just had.
Mm-hmm.
And we did add to this at the end, those 4 that are in the cover memo.
Councilor Surratt, you had
I had a process question about
Okay.
informing that discussion and what
Yeah.
this body should be doing around that.
Okay. Anything else? One of the things that's beginning to raise its head and getting louder and louder and louder is tolling. And my guess is eventually OMPOC, especially our folks up north, this is gonna be a louder and louder conversation. And the loudness is beginning to grow, is opposed to any tolling, and it's getting really loud and starting to pick up steam. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. You know, we heard the loud sucking noise with the Columbia River crossing. This is what this potentially could be as well. So one of the things I would look at both Mayor Lumberg and with Kate is just to make sure that our voices are at the table. And in this area, our MPO is heard and our issues are heard, so that all of a sudden, those particular issues in the metro area just don't overtake, because that tolling issue is gonna be really, really loud. And as you know, it's to the point. Now, the last time I drove I-5, I didn't even go 205. In fact, I cut over, is it 405? 405, and then cut back on I-5. I mean, it's to the point now, you're just looking for anything you can just to get through that area. And it's not fun. I think Portland is actually getting worse than Seattle, and I hate to, it's hard to believe that. Seattle's just longer. But when it comes to just stop, it's becoming such a mess up there, and it's hurting the commercial side as well as the, just the folks in personal autos as well. But, so I'm just gonna ask that I know neither one of you are bashful, and that's the good news. And so, just to make sure that our MPO is gonna be heard, our issues will be heard, and because I think this tolling issue is really gonna start picking up a lot of steam as we lead into the legislative session, so. Mayor?
So people are for or against it, and what does this?
Oh, no, they're gathering signatures to get on the ballot to oppose the tolling, and it's really getting steam, a lot of it.
So I would be interested to hear from this group, you know, preferences.
Frankly, this was part of the package, the transportation package. Tolling was mentioned in there. I'll leave that.
Well, so a little background on why we may directly care, even if this area doesn't implement suggestion pricing or tolling anytime in the near future. HB 2017 did authorize a congestion pricing pilot project in the Portland area, and the committees have been working on that, mainly focused in the Portland area as far as representation. I've been trying to follow that. There is some local opposition building, to put it mildly. And why it could matter to us is because of the funding implications that would trickle down or not trickle down to us.
Yeah.
Simply put, if you recall, HB 2017 implemented some revenue increases right off the bat, and then incremental increases every 2 years. So there's still more future gas tax increases, registration and other fee increases to come. That revenue hasn't been dedicated to anything yet, at least on the ODOT portion of it. The thinking was that in order to build some of the major Portland projects, there would be local contributions, and part of those local contributions or part of the contributions to the funding could come from tolling. If those revenues don't materialize, the legislature could direct more of the future statewide revenue towards those Portland projects and less towards Beltline.
Yeah. And that's why I think it'll be interesting just to see where the conversation goes. But I think it just make sure you're aware, and that our area is not being neglected, which I'm glad the two of you are going to be there, because that's going to be really important to make sure our voices are strong, and we don't get completely overtaken by what goes on at JPAC and so on and so forth. So that's my only. I'll bring that up, and we're starting to already hear it even from the county perspective. At AOC, a Transportation Community Development Committee, tolling is in that whole issue is starting to raise its head, where to the point that our 3 Marion County commissioners are actually looking to get engaged to oppose And so it's kind of interesting to see where that goes.
And it sounds like they're trying to use it for congestion mitigation as well as a revenue stream. So to direct traffic to other places, but also raise money for statewide transportation projects.
Well, they've termed it as a congestion pricing pilot project, but all of the language now has tolling in parentheses.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, if, you know, the congestion pricing for the I-205 Willamette River crossing project up there, Westland, Oregon City, that bridge, is to pay for improvements and expansion of that bridge, both seismic and capacity.
Yep.
Mr. Chair, if I could, the other sort of nuance of tolling is that if and as it becomes part of a successful funding package for congestion in the Portland area, then that expectation is going to leak out to some of the other MPOs around the state that we need to start tolling so that we can bring that level of match to the table to leverage the big projects. And, you know, I mean, you folks will represent, but I think within Central Lane, we have a different level and types of congestion than the Portland area. So the one-size-fits-all approach may not, you know, across Oregon, just, it worked in Portland, now Eugene, Springfield, you guys do it. So I think to be mindful about that and to see what the will of the group is with respect to that. And it was an early part of the HB 2017 legislative development. We were actually had to think about that and talk about it and see where that value fit in the scheme down here.
Toll roundabouts.
Unless it's automatic.
No accidents ever.
Bend will be in a lot of cash, won't they? That's just right.
So, again, just kind of going back to process, would it be helpful to have a response to the staff recommendation?
Typically, what we've done is ask for what level of comfort you are providing input at this point. Again, this is a sort of a two-part conversation that we try and have, which is this MPO is setting its priorities, but we've also recognized that the 8 Oregon MPOs are stronger going to Salem as OMPOC. Again, right now, it's sort of a draft discussion for tomorrow's meeting. We'll come back from tomorrow's meeting to tell you what the statewide consortium is proposing as the priorities, and then we would ask for a more formal input from you. But, you know, it's mainly up to, again, your OMPOC representatives, what level of input or reassurance they need today.
Okay. Well, you probably know that, at least as Rob has presented it to us, that the City of Eugene has had the automated speed enforcement piece, and the local authority on speed limits is something that we're interested in. For me personally, on the Safe Routes to School funding question and changing that formula, I would like to see more discussion about that and get a better sense. I think what you talked about, the trade-offs, potentialities of one versus the other is very interesting, and I'd like to learn a little bit more about the discussion and what comes out of that.
We could bring more information back.
Yeah, and I think when Rob was on the Rules Committee, maybe you still are, there was discussion about a rural piece of it as well, because that's what comes to mind for me, is that a lot of the rural communities may not be able to meet that 40% match, and some of our other communities as well, but very specifically. And so I think that being reminded of what those provisions are and the rules are for the size of areas and the schools themselves and locations would be great.
Yep, we can do that.
So, I agree. It's always unique to have it. The MPOs are located on the I-5 corridor except for Bend. And so it's everybody that's impacted, particularly with the corridor, but you have all the way from Rogue Valley all the way to Portland Metro. So it's quite a group to get together and come to consensus on a package of what you want to see collectively, and you cannot underestimate the position of the Portland area at the table, and inflexibility is one word that comes to mind in terms of, you know, what the rest of the state ought to be doing. So, so having clear direction, you know, what we want to see is very important, but it's well noted, you know, just more information about safe routes to schools and some of those last four issues on the table there. And it will be a shorter, we couldn't possibly, as OMPOC, come to agreement on everything on this list, you know, it'd be pretty big.
Well, on items 1 through 12, they did.
Yes, and
Yeah.
we did,
Yeah.
yes, yes, but that was before the CMAC discussion, which didn't go as well. Anyway, so, you know, and it does behoove us, we are the metro area, so we do have that in common as across the state, so I'm okay with that, as long as everybody in the room is okay with what we're taking forward.
Any other comments, questions?
Would it make sense for us to take any of this stuff off from what was achieved last year, or are we looking at keeping the same thing? I mean, I think our priorities have shifted, and there's a few things in here, like transit funding. I hate to be the person to say, should we remove that from the priority list? But that was a huge piece of HB 2017. And then the transit student youth pass is something that, you know, LTD is working on as a part of the fair policy discussion. And there is a percentage of the transit funds that are dedicated to youth pass, right, Edward? 1%?
They're not dedicated to it, but.
It's
they are,
suggested.
suggested.
Yes. So I don't know if it helps to take things off of our list to prioritize the other things that have not happened yet. It's just an idea. I don't know if that's useful or not.
No, I think that's helpful. I mean, that's somewhat the idea of prioritizing it.
Right.
And, you know, again, I think going into tomorrow's statewide discussion, the idea was to start with a broader list and then have that statewide body try and narrow it down to the extent they are comfortable doing so. But if you are, again, want to suggest narrowing it down for you and Mayor Lundberg as members tomorrow, I hear you on both of those suggestions. I'm not convinced that all the transit districts, especially some of the smaller ones around the state, have achieved the level of funding or that they would like to see.
Yeah. I'm not sure we have either.
And this is just a beginning point for discussion.
Okay, do you feel good?
Sure.
We're ready for battle.
After a long day.
Ready for battle. Paul, anything else?
I was going to mention real briefly, in terms of legislative update, I received, as some of you may have also, the news of what the U.S. Senate passed this morning, and I was going to speak to it, but then we have a newly minted federal expert in the room. So, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't. But basically, the Senate this morning, and I'm just going to summarize this, the U.S. Senate this morning did pass the Transportation Appropriations Bill. It still has to go through the House and through all of that, rest of that process. But the good news is that the Senate bill that passed this morning strongly supported funding for BUILD grants, which is the former Tiger grants, strongly supported continued transit funding, and strongly supported Amtrak operations. And I'm noting those three in large part because those three were all somewhat contrary perhaps to the current administrative directions. So that's encouraging. There's still a lot to come before there's final, word on that, but it's a good direction.
Good. All right. Anything else? Okay, thank you very much. Edward, you've been sitting here for a long time, so I guess you're up next. So next is a Transit Tomorrow presentation, and Paul, I don't know if you want to introduce it, and then, or just turn it right over to Edward. All right.
Take it away.
And I think we probably need, some of us need to move, is that right?
Are we?
Oh, no, there's no PowerPoint.
Oh, there isn't, okay.
Okay, good. Thought maybe you just needed a stretch break. I was like, go for it.
Well, I could always use that.
It's just, yeah, get printed two-sided. Sorry about that. Paul's new to streets. Got some fact sheets going around.
Take two, Mark, for those who get in the right way. Try and make sure that happens.
Okay, well, thank you all for having me here. My name is Edward McLone. I'm the Public Affairs Director for Lane Transit District. As Paul alluded to, I will be that for about 3 more days. So I want to thank you all for, take a moment just to thank all of you for your work in our community and for helping me throughout my time at LTD. I've enjoyed working with all of you. I am moving on to a position on the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee back in Washington, D.C., starting in a couple of weeks here. So I'm excited to spend one of my last days at LTD at MPC. It seems only a fitting way to go. Today I'm here to talk to you about an exciting project that we're working on called Transit Tomorrow. You've probably heard it referred to in its technical term over the past several months as the COA, or Comprehensive Operations Analysis. What this project is it's a big picture look, and it's both big picture and minute level look at the transportation system and our operations from a public transit standpoint. It blends kind of 3 core pieces of information to help us analyze, understand, and then make potential future changes to the way that we deliver transit service to our community. Those 3 big buckets of information are: 1, transit data. Our buses are a wealth of information. The vehicles themselves know, but they produce a lot of it. They have GPS trackers that are tied to time and date stamps, which are tied to something called automated passenger counters, which essentially means we know at every time of the day on any bus route where the bus is, where it stopped, and how many people got on or off, if the bus ramp went out to allow someone with a mobility device to get on or off. We even have data to know when we pick up bicycles at the stops. So what we've done is we've hired a consulting firm to help us through this project. And one of the first things they did was look at all of this data that we have to create a really deep understanding of where is the transit system today. What is it doing? How is it running? Where are some points of strength? Where are some points for potential consideration where there could be improvements? That led to a report called the Choices Report, which Mr. Zico spoke to you about earlier today. That report and a much easier and shorter read called an executive summary is available on LTD's website. You can access Transit Tomorrow's webpage directly from our homepage. So the Choices Report really outlined kind of the current conditions. It was an analysis of where we're at and kind of outlined some big picture questions that we'll need to be thinking about in the future. As all of you know, as either administrators of public agencies or elected officials governing public agencies, money does not grow on trees, and our taxpayers don't want us to spend it like it does. And that means that as we make choices about how we invest in our transit system, it is not a zero-based game where we have all the money in the world. When we make changes to our system, or we make decisions to invest in one place, that dollar that we spend in one area is a dollar that we don't have to spend in another. And so the Choices Report really kind of outlines some of those choices. Kind of the core points behind them are: 1, this idea of frequency versus coverage. And you heard Rob talk about productivity a little bit earlier today as well. We have 100 buses. They can only be in 100 places at one time. We can't make them be in 2 places at one time. If we want a bus to come every 10 minutes down one road, it means that we have to have a lot of buses on that road for it to go back and forth and always have a bus every 10 minutes. Think about if you were going out to do your grocery shopping and then you had a bunch of other errands to go. You can only have one car. If you're going in a straight line, you can make the errand fairly quickly. But if you have to go to all kinds of different places, you're not going to be able to get to as many stops as quickly as possible. And that is kind of the buses running up and down a single corridor really quickly, or buses going to a lot of different places. We're not able to do both at the same time. So one of those big questions then that we'll have to engage as a community, you guys as leaders of our community and our customers as well, is what are the priorities? So that kind of leads us into the second big piece of information that the consultants are looking at, and that's public feedback. So we launched on June 26th the public involvement process for this project with a big half-day-long event called the Stakeholder Forum. The Stakeholder Forum was where we brought in key players in our community involved in public service that we work with closely, key stakeholders like the Chambers of Commerce and business leaders who pay our taxes, the University of Oregon, and your local governments as well. There were staff from, I think, every organization here represented, and one of the elected officials from Eugene, Springfield, and Lane County who serve on LTD's Strategic Planning Committee were also invited to participate in this. What the forum did was it pretty much outlined some of those big trade-off choices, which are also talked about in the fact sheet that you have at your table. It asked them to go through a number of exercises where essentially you were given a map of a pretend city. And it had some kind of like heat mapping of here are core density areas, here are core low-income areas, and just like any normal community, they weren't all in the same place. So you had to build a transit system around this community where you know there's probably some shooting fish in a barrel transit ridership areas, and far away from them perhaps are some other areas that really need transit service. We asked folks to go through that exercise to kind of start to apply some of the challenges that we needed to be playing with as a transit agency and help them understand those questions. And you learn a lot about the way a community thinks about its transit system when you see what those maps look like. We asked all those groups, there were about 50 or so of them, participants at that forum, to go out and spread the word about an online interactive survey that we launched a couple of days later. That survey has been open for about a month now and will be open through the end of August. As of yesterday, over 600 people have participated in the survey, which is really a pretty good number, particularly over the summer months. And the survey takes about 5 minutes or less to fill out, and it's really, again, core questions about values. Some of the other things that, if you think about it, a bus can stop a lot of times along a route and means that no one has to get off and walk very far, which is great because it means the bus is at the door where you're at, and the bus drops you off at the door where you're going. But the bad news is if you have to drop off 18 people in a 5-block area, and they're stopping every single one of those blocks, the bus isn't moving very quickly. So one of the balance points then is that how much are people willing to have to walk a little bit further maybe to get where they're going if it means their bus is going to move a lot faster to where they're headed eventually. So those are some of those other trade-offs that we're looking at. The final big piece of big information that the Transit Tomorrow project's looking at are existing local plans. So those are going to be your transportation system plans, the coordinated human services transportation plan, growth plans as well. So what does your urban growth boundary look like? What are your zoning plans? Where do you as a city foresee the growth happening? And also not just local government plans, but also the University of Oregon, their campus and growth plans, their long-term intentions of where they're planning on having growth of enrollment, shrinking enrollment, those types of things, as well as some of the big developments that are happening in our community. The Fifth Street Public Market is one of those ideas. Everything out in Gateway is another. Looking at some of those big drivers to understand what's going to redevelop, what's going to change, not just next year, but in a 10 to 20-year timeline. Because what the ultimate goal of this project is to take all of this information and create a long-term plan for the transit system and a short-term plan. So we'll have a 3-year plan that really is immediate next steps. Next year, LTD is going to do X, Y, and Z. The year after that, they're going to do A, B, and C, and the year after that, they'll do D, E, and F. But in the 10-year plan, it's saying, we know these are the conditions, this is the growth, and this is what the district needs to be doing to prepare itself. So we've provided a lot of those planning documents already to the consultants, or they've sought them out by working through your staff. And then they'll also be hosting on September 10th, or starting on September 10th, a 3.5-day long workshop with planning staff from the various local governments around. Everyone here is represented, as well as some of the other communities, Cottage Grove, Crestwell, Veneta, Junction City, where their planners are asked to join the technical planners from LTD staff and the consultant group to actually start kind of designing maps of potential changes to the transit system and development plans for what a 3 to 10-year plan is. So that's sort of the big picture of the 3 big pieces of information and kind of the 3 big places that they're being collected. What I want to talk about next, and this is also available, I'm stealing Paul's copy, I'm sure he won't mind. On the second page of your fact sheet is a multicolor, well, it's grayish and greenish, single color, single shade, timeline of the project. So where we're at right now is we're in the established community priorities section. So we're doing a lot of public involvement. This evening, if anyone's interested in going, we'll be out in Veneta doing a listening session that was organized in part by the local government out there and the Chamber of Commerce. We've done stuff in Eugene, Springfield, and Cottage Grove as well. So we're doing the listening sessions, interactive survey, stakeholder forum, that first round. And then we'll also do that big core design workshop that I talked about the September 10th with your staff. All of that information then will be taken, put together, and over the next couple of months, our technical planners who we've hired will be putting together a series of potential options. What we really wanted to be very clear with the consultants is that this is not LTD driving the system and our board of directors making decisions, but it's really about the vision that our community has, the values that our community has, and then the needs that our local government partners have for transit to serve in their community. And so one of the most important parts of that for us was public involvement, but the other part was that we have multiple options. So what they're going to come out with is a series of potential recommendations that we'll bring back out to the community. So it's not just going to be one size fits all saying this LTD is what needs to happen, now go sell it to your community. Instead, we're going to bring it out, there's going to be lines on maps, and that's really where, if you'll forgive the pun, the rubber's going to hit the road. People are going to start to see their bus routes change, the service in their neighborhoods potentially change in a number of possibly different ways throughout each of the different scenarios. With that information in hand, and we're planning, the work is supposed to wrap up right about Thanksgiving, just before, just after Thanksgiving, but we realized that the period of time between Thanksgiving and New Year's is a complete dead zone for getting the community to pay attention to what you're doing. And so the project's going to take a little bit of a break. Our staff will take that time to further prepare for the next round of public involvement. And then after the new year, we'll release those series of potential changes to the transit system and embark on another pretty intensive public involvement process. And it'll basically be kind of copy and paste from round one. So we'll start it with the stakeholder forum, hoping to have, again, 50 to 70 or so community leaders at that. There'll be a presentation here at MPC. There'll be an interactive survey. There'll be public hearings at our board of directors. And what we're seeking is to understand, A, what people like about the proposed changes, what people don't like about the proposed changes, and if there's anything that we've missed as well. We'll take that. The consultants, again, will go back. They'll further refine it, maybe narrow it down to a couple of potential options, which will then go back out for a public hearing and our board of directors to take action on in the mid-spring, April, May or so of 2019. So that's sort of the big picture of this project. We wanted to come. We know we haven't had a chance to get before MPC yet, as this project has taken more definition. I think it's something that's been talked about kind of in generalities, but it really started to sprint forward in the past few months. Our board of directors, based on feedback from our community, has been pushing to have this project wrapped up in a 12 to 18-month window. And so we on the staff side have been sprinting to make sure we hit those timelines and are pleased to say a couple months in that we are so far on track. So I will wrap up my presentation portion of this and turn it over to you all for further discussion.
Questions? Mayor Vince.
So I know we have a counselor sitting on this, in this process. So is there some way in which the city councils would be involved, or how do we, is there some constructive way in which we engage in this process, or?
Yeah, I think, there's a number of ways that we'd like to involve you and then are also open to kind of working with you guys. So, obviously on an individual basis, counselors and other elected officials or appointed officials can take the survey. That's the easiest one-person way to do it. Using the plans that are adopted by your councils of what your regional priorities are through your transportation system plan, climate and energy action plan, transportation safety action plan, coordinated human services. We're able to pull those policy directives. But if there's really kind of direct involvement with the councils that you guys would like, we'd be happy to come and do a workshop with you guys or attend a council meeting and do some discussion and presentation as well.
Yeah, just as a response, I think that would be valuable, actually, for the.
And I will say that in our strategic planning committee meeting that we had 2 weeks ago, it was a special meeting because it was summer and we're having a hard time getting people to attend. We reviewed the entire choices report. Tom walked us through just about every single page of it. And the group that was there are probably the most educated group of people in the community. And it is an open meeting. People can come sit in it and listen. And then we do, as Edward said, have representation from both councils on it.
Right, I just think it would be helpful for council
Yeah.
to have an opportunity to hear it and make the connections with other policies that we have approved.
Yeah, we'd be happy to contact staff and make sure we get something on the agenda.
Councilor Wiley?
Yeah, well, I was thinking of some of the same things. I'm on the Springfield Council now, and a few years ago, I spent 8 years on the LTD board during the planning time for MX. And, you know, but we struggled and worked very hard to put in the foundation of our current transportation system with a station in Eugene and a station in Springfield and serving the hospital and serving the university. 4 major pieces of that foundation of our transportation system. And I would hope that that would be not lost when people start saying, oh, let's redesign, you know. And it's wonderful to get public input. It's wonderful to grow and to stay current. But we do need to respect, and that's institutional history with councils and whatnot, of people who've served on, worked on these projects for the last 20 years. And so that is just really important that that aspect is properly respected in folding together the new plans.
Counselor, you're absolutely right. That's part of why we didn't want to create an environment where it's the loudest voice in the room rules the room. And that's why there's this kind of 3-piece where there's public involvement, there's existing plans, and then there's also the kind of data that support it. Because we want to make sure that we're making informed decisions. And we also know that certain aspects of the geography of our community aren't changing. The University of Oregon has been there since the 1800s. It's not moving. Peace Health, they have their new location, but they're probably not going to uproot that and move either. Main Street will be Main Street. River Road will be River Road. And the highway out to Veneta will, until we are able to work with the Corps to fix it, be the highway out to Veneta. And so those are areas that we know we will have to serve. The questions, I think, for those pieces then, that's when we get into some of those questions of, should we be serving it more often? Can we space the stops out a little more to make it go faster? Or does our community really value having a transit system where, maybe the bus doesn't come as often, but it goes to a lot more places, and the bus moves a little bit slower, but people don't have to walk as far. And so that's where we're trying to strike that balance.
So I just want to add on Hillary's comments, because I think that's really what she mentioned, the history here. So I'm looking around. So we had then Councilor Pat Farr, Councilor Sid Lykin, Councilor Christine Lumberg, and Board Member Hillary Wiley, BRT.
Yeah.
So you have 4 of us, and 2 of us will be gone here at the end of the year.
Yeah.
And going through that entire process of what was called bus rapid transit, first of all, it was in the very beginning stages, it was really pretty incredible, and LTD was one of only a handful around the country where dollars were identified. And so that was good news. The other thing, and this is where I'm going to look over at AJ, because I think she's going to play probably one of the most pivotal roles in this whole issue. And I think it's great you're meeting with the government leaders, the city councilors, and that type of thing. But I think where BRT, one of the major reasons why that was able to move forward because of a woman named Phyllis Luby, who was the general manager. Phyllis had such a connection with the business community. And that's to me is really important. And I'm not just talking about the chambers of commerce. She knew the big real estate players, and that is going to be key. I think AJ will end up being a pivotal piece of this because of the general manager of LTD having to go out and meet with the leadership of the business community will be very important in moving this forward. Because if it's fine getting the electeds involved, that's great. But most of us don't own big pieces of corners of real estate that you may need in order to move, visions like this along. But people in the business community do. And it's not necessarily people engaged with your Chamber of Commerce's. That's the reality. But instead, It's other folks. And I know, AJ, I've gotten actually really good feedback from certain business folks who really like you. And that's why I say, I think you'll play a pivotal role in this because of that reason. You can go out, you have an ability to sit down with folks and say, this is why this is important for our entire community, whether you're low income, middle income, high income, it doesn't matter. What this will do for the entire community, this vision will play a big role. Engaging that part of it will be huge, especially here in the metro area, but also in the communities outside. You're going to Veneta, whether you like him or not, someone's going to have to engage with Greg Demers. I don't care if you like him or not, but Greg owns most of Veneta in that entire area. He's the biggest property owner out there. And for me personally, I find him easy to communicate with, but that's just me. And but that's a reality. So meeting with the folks at the Veneta and the city council and the leadership there is one thing, but someone's going to have to pick up the phone and call Greg and say, we want to sit down and talk to you about this vision. He's not going to buy it, I promise you. He won't. And especially if you get certain folks who believe in what you're doing in the room. I'm a short timer and I can say just about anything I want right now. And so, but I do believe strongly that's something you need to do. You need to engage in folks that maybe you don't really think about, but are going to be absolutely key, because if you get him on board out in that area, believe me, you're going to get a lot of people on board. And regardless, whether you're in downtown Eugene, downtown Springfield, Cottage Grove, there's certain folks that you got to be engaged with. And I think, AJ, you're going to play one of the most important roles in that whole conversation. That's my two cents on it. But that's how BRT was able to get moving in the way it did, because Phyllis Luby actually engaged with a lot of these major business players that help move things along, especially in the Franklin corridor, because there were a couple folks who own a lot of property that weren't so sure about it. But yet, because she was able to say, no, this is how important this will be, you get them on board. They may not have been 100%, but at least they weren't going to say no. And that, to me, is going to be really important. So that's my 2 cents on this, but I think it's great what you're trying to accomplish here, and I really appreciate that. But the business community will play a huge, huge role in moving this vision forward. Okay.
I just want to talk to what Hillary was talking about. So it's a really interesting time to be doing this Transit Tomorrow project, because we've been working on the Moving Ahead project and also the Main McVeigh, the transit study, and then the safety project as well. And so there's a lot of information out there to inform the work that we do from this information that comes out. And I think that it'll be really interesting. I know we'll start having joint council meetings with Eugene to talk about moving ahead in the corridors and the BRT, and just kind of see how everything develops. And knowing what our community wants from us in regards to the future of our transportation system and our transit is going to be, I think, one of the most important pieces to being able to determine what decisions come out of moving ahead or Main McVeigh, or any sort of service changes, or how to spend the STIF money that's coming to LTD, if we're spending more on rural, if we're spending it more on local, if we're doing total change in our fare policies. I mean, there's so much information to come out of this study, which is one of the reasons why the board has wanted it to be kind of in a more rapid succession, so that it can start informing some of the financial decisions that we're making in the very, very near future. So the information is there, and it is absolutely the foundation from which we're working. And that's one of the things that Jared Walker and Associates has made sure, is that all of that information is informing the choices report, and therefore will inform the alternatives when we get them. It's good stuff.
And I think, just if I might piggyback on what Kate was saying, I do want to make sure we create a distinction too. There's the Moving Ahead project, which is looking at 5 potential corridors in Eugene. There's the Main Street project, which is looking at Main Street in Springfield. Those projects are separate from this. Those are really corridor-based projects that are looking at infrastructure and what is needed in order to deliver better transit, better pedestrian access, and better safety for people on those corridors. those are their own projects that are moving on their own schedule with their own governance. And this is more of a kind of a basic bus kind of analysis, if you will. So I just wanted to make sure that we're clear about those two differences, because I know that's important for folks in our community to know, and I want to make sure that you all as leaders in that community know that too.
Anything else? Edward, thank you very much, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Edward.
Good luck to you.
Good luck. We're gonna send transportation.
Yeah, flowers.
Okay, next up, we have follow-up steps, and first up is ODOT update. Lots of
Yes.
construction.
Yeah, a little bit about construction. So we are paving the belt line from Roosevelt to Coburg Road. It should be a nice product when it's done, but I wanted to talk about that for a few minutes. We have Knife River Construction doing the paving for us. And last year, they were working on a project in I-5 to pave between Woodburn and Wilsonville, and they lost one of their workers in an accident during construction. And so they came to ODOT and said, is there any way we can do some worker safety? What we'd really like to do is isolate the work area from the traffic. And so they brought to us a proposal that would close off part of the road so that they could pave it and then put both directions of traffic on the other side of the road. And so we've been doing that we have 5 weekends. We went through 2 weekends already, and we have 3 more weekends to go, where we are closing sections of the belt line and opening up the other side to two-way traffic with nothing but a barrel in between the opposing directions. And you know what? It's working. And the workers are behind a barrier, and they're paving the shoulders, the lanes, they're laying all the asphalt, making it seamless, and then they're striping, and then they're done with that whole section, and it's open. So they close the section from 9 o'clock on Friday night till 5 a.m. on Monday. It's well advertised, but everybody should know to look at tripcheck.com, or org, is it? Anyway, go to TripCheck, you'll find it, and they talk about specifically what's going on. But the next 2 weekends are going to be a little tricky, because we are going to be closing the area between Northwest Expressway and Highway 99. And as you know, there's a lot of traffic that goes to and from the airport, especially on the weekends. But both directions of travel.
Or to and from my house.
Yeah. So from Friday night to Monday morning, both directions of travel will be on the eastbound lanes, and they'll be working on the westbound lanes. There'll be nice crossovers, there'll be plenty of detours, lots of signage to let people know what to do, but just plan your trip ahead, take a little extra time if you're going to Junction City or the airport or Jerry's or whatever. And then next weekend, we'll be finishing that section by putting traffic on the westbound lanes and paving the eastbound lanes. And then the last weekend of the 5 weekend closures, we'll be working on and off ramps. And then we will be done. So it'll be nicely paved from Coburg Road. Oh, and meanwhile, nighttime paving is happening between River Road and Coburg Road, just at night during the week. So we should be done beginning of October with the whole project, and Beltline will be paved and nice. So that's good news. Also, there's a lot of paving going on between Eugene and Bonita, mostly on the Bonita end of 126 West. So nighttime, one lane, we're down to one lane, and traffic stops and queues. But they're open on the weekends for the weekend travel to the coast, so that's happening. The other couple things, we're starting on our kickoff meeting for the River Road to Coburg Road environmental document and the planning phase for that. That starts next Thursday, where our consultant CH2M Hill and my project manager Molly Carey are leading a multiple jurisdictional team to talk about the timeline and the scope of that project. Now, that project doesn't have any construction funds yet, but we are working to get the preferred alternative on the build. As you remember, the facility plan was done several years ago. We have it in the TSP, thanks to the City of Eugene, this work, and so now it's the next logical step is to get that selected alternative. And then we will talk about timelines of how to chunk those projects out and go for funding one way or another. We'll find a way to fund those projects. So that work is important. And the last thing I want to say is there's a Safe Routes to School that's been talked about a lot, workshop next Thursday, August 8th, from 2:30 to 4:15 here in Springfield at the Agnes Stewart Middle School, 900 South 32nd Street from 2:30 to 4:15. So that'll be before the Lane Act meeting. And then Bill has a couple things he'd like to talk about.
Yes, thank you, Franny. Just a quick update on the 2021-24 STIP process. We haven't talked about that in a while. You may remember that this STIP cycle, we're focusing on leverage opportunities. ODOT staff developed a 150% list of fix-it projects, we call them, maintenance-related fixes. And then ODOT staff also identified potential leverage opportunities, basically enhancements to those fix-it projects for bike ped enhancements or safety enhancements, or in a couple of cases, some operational improvements. We also provided an opportunity for local governments to provide suggestions to us. We asked for those by the end of June. We received some suggestions from the City of Eugene, the City of Springfield. Lane County indicated that they were confident in ODOT's ability to identify safety enhancements, especially on county roads. There was another follow-up meeting with ODOT staff just earlier this week, and I'm pleased to report that all of the local suggestions from Area 5 did make the cut list to continue on into the scoping process. That's significant. Not all local proposals or suggestions in Region 2 were advanced into the scoping process. So we will be scoping these projects this summer, and when we're all done with the scoping, we'll reconvene and look at what the scoping information tells us and figure out which fix-it projects and enhancement projects we would make the 100% list.
Tom?
Could I maybe prevail upon Franny or Bill to talk a little bit about the I-5, I-205 projects up in Portland? 1 lane, 4-hour delays predicted, go a different way, find a different time. Just as general information.
Don't go there.
Yeah, don't go.
You know, I'm not as cued into what's happening with their
All I
construction
remember is
timeline. I'm
it's big
sorry,
and
but
scary.
it has to do with, isn't it to 84, ramps off, on and off to 84
Yeah, I
from
think it's
I-5?
right, and yeah.
So there's road closures, and all I'd have to tell you is check, trip check.
Definitely. Or
I mean, you
plan on
just
sitting
really
in
need to
traffic.
do that, especially if you're going to the airport in Portland.
you
And
can
that's gonna be
sign up
happening through the summer.
for alerts.
So-
We have a wonderful airport here.
Yes.
You do not have to go to PDX by car.
Councilor Sweat?
Thank you. Sorry
I
to
will
jump
have,
the queue.
Tom, I'll bring some updates to that, of like when the project will be completed, things like that.
Or
and
just
send-
an email that
Yeah.
can go out, a
Okay.
reminder.
I just wanted to let Franny know I got a note from a constituent who lives near the Beltline who said that paving has really reduced traffic noise into their neighborhood.
Good. Yeah, we had that old F mix, which was open graded, very noisy.
They had noticed that another part had received it some years ago, and it was quieter over there, and they were still noisy, so now they're feeling good.
Good, that's good to hear.
Okay, Springfield Main Street, safety update.
Yeah, Bill?
Briefly, yes. Work is proceeding. We're off to a good start on this project. The project team has been meeting with the City Planning Commission, City Council, and the governance team to brief them on the scope of the project. There was a story that appeared in the Register Guard yesterday. You may have seen it. Describes how the City of Springfield and the project team is soliciting applications from members of the community who want to participate in a Citizens Advisory Committee. So that emphasizes how important public involvement is for this project, and the City of Springfield's special sensitivity to that. I have to say, a lot of projects like this would just appoint an advisory committee, so it's commendable that the city is thinking in terms of asking for applications and looking at a broad cross-section in the community.
Okay. Next, rail update. I don't know if we even have anything.
I
Brenda?
do have something, update. Some of you may recall, and I know rail updates, the time period between updates is pretty big, but Some of you may recall that the state of Washington has been looking at the business case for establishing high-speed rail between Portland and British Columbia, and the legislature, the Washington legislature, has dedicated $750,000 to that effort. Last week, they received another $750,000, making it $1.5 million. ODOT contributed $200,000. British Columbia contributed $300,000, and Microsoft contributed the last $300,000. So they now have $1.5 million to evaluate speeds up to 250 miles per hour on some of that route. And again, this is an evaluation, this is not building rail. So, but it is moving forward, and hopefully we'll be able to give you another update before the end of the year and see how that's going, so.
Very good. Okay, so UMPOC, so we heard
Meeting
that's tomorrow.
Yeah.
Meeting tomorrow, the majority of it is, well, again, one of the key discussions is around legislative priorities. So we'll get back to you next month.
All right. And Lane Act, we were down last month, and
Yes, here's a brief summary of what's on the agenda for next Wednesday, August 8th. There's a presentation on safe routes to school. Edward will make a repeat appearance to talk about transit tomorrow.
no, somebody else will.
Somebody else.
Or someone will. We'll be providing an update on the Lane Act work plan for the coming year, summarizing efforts to implement House Bill 2017, some of the accountability measures you talked about earlier. Statewide Transportation Improvement Fund, we'll be talking about that, and STIP updates similar to the one I just provided.
Okay. All right, so MTIP administrative amendments, where they're in here, so anything to add?
As usual, they're here if there
All
are any
right.
questions.
Okay, so next meeting is in Eugene, next month, September 6th. See you then, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.